Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of Truth is Justice. Before we continue with the week-by-week analysis, I wanted to address some of the things raised during the most recent episode of Bob Ruff's show. Now, you'd all be aware of how we approach this podcast. We conduct a week-by-week analysis, and we look at each and every statement, and where necessary, correct the misleading statements. And we intend to stick with that, but this most recent episode of Bob's was so extraordinary, such a terrible misrepresentation of the facts, that we felt it was important to raise some of those misleading statements immediately. I found myself having to listen multiple times to the final several minutes of Bob discussing the interview, for the simple reason that I couldn't quite believe what I was hearing. And this wasn't just a simple mistake or a verbal misstep. This was a quite extraordinary misrepresentation of the interview. A level of misrepresentation that could have been easily corrected if Bob so intended, but after listening to his words multiple times, I'm confidently of the view that this misrepresentation by Bob was entirely deliberate, and perhaps he was relying upon some of his listeners not listening closely to his words, or not listening to the interview, or reading the transcripts, or not speaking Spanish, or just generally zoning out, because the level of deception going on here is almost beyond belief. Atty, a native Spanish speaker, has posted an excellent detailed summary of her thoughts on our Facebook group, and I encourage you to have a look at that. I will also try to explain here exactly what the deception looks like. Firstly, Bob notes that the thing he finds most interesting about the interview is the way the term manos, meaning hands, and brazos, meaning arms, are used interchangeably. And to be clear, Bob is noting that this is the case during this specific interview, that there is regular changing between the two terms. But let's have a closer look at that, and see whether there is any truth to it. Now we can check how many times the word manos is used during the interview. It's used 8 times by Herman, and it's used twice by Deputy Garcia. And we can also check how many times the word brazos is used during the interview. It's used 1 time by Herman, and it's not used at all by Deputy Garcia. So that statement that the terms manos and brazos were used interchangeably during the interview is entirely incorrect. They are not at all used interchangeably. They are both used by Herman to describe something very specific about Sandra's bindings. And that takes us to the second point. Bob then notes that we hear Herman use the term brazos to explain how Sandra was tied up, and Bob says that he used this term multiple times. But does he? Does Herman actually use that word, brazos, multiple times to explain how Sandra was tied up? No, he uses it once, and once only, and not in the context of where the binding was. The context of Herman's use of the word brazos was in his description of how Sandra's hands were tied. Herman notes that her arms were towards her back. That is it. And then it is back to the use of the word manos. So just going over that again, Bob said that Herman used the term brazos multiple times, and to quote Bob, he also used the word hands a few times too. Now, is that correct? Well, no, it isn't. Herman used the term manos, meaning hands, 8 times. So, Bob has not only reduced the instances of the unhelpful word manos from 8 times down to a few, but he has elevated the importance of the term brazos from just once to multiple times. It's simply incredible. And this leads us then to the third point. And Bob notes that Deputy Garcia primarily refers to Sandra's bindings as involving her hands. And he makes the astonishing suggestion that Deputy Garcia's use of the word hands influenced how Herman referred to them as the interview goes on. And Bob then goes on to quote a section of the interview, a section that is over halfway through the interview, and involves the only section where Herman uses the word arms throughout the whole interview. Actually, the only section where the term arms is used at all. Now, Bob inaccurately notes the words Herman used in this interaction as being him describing how Sandra's arms were tied. And that's simply not what is said, not at all. The specific words used are, and to quote in English, with her arms towards the back. How that can be interpreted by Bob as meaning Herman said that Sandra's arms were tied as opposed to her hands, which he had used to describe the bindings 5 times previously, is beyond my comprehension. To go further, let's look closely at Bob's suggestion here that Deputy Garcia influenced how Herman referred to the bindings. How many times prior to this section had Herman used the word hands to refer to how the bindings were positioned? 5. Yes, 5 separate times Herman had used the word hands before this interaction, and Deputy Garcia's use of the word that Bob suggests influenced Herman's description. So Herman goes on to use the word hands 3 more times after that interaction. But do you think Deputy Garcia influenced Herman's description? Absolutely not. That doesn't even appear remotely possible. In fact, I have absolutely no idea how anyone could even suggest that in any kind of serious way. And Bob then wraps up with a simply unbelievable statement, one that I couldn't quite believe I was hearing. It truly is misrepresentation at its most blatant, at its most raw, and at its most easily identifiable. And blatant because we all have the interview, and we all have the translations, and it takes simply minutes to see the reality. So Bob says that one of the big questions he had going into listening to the interview was how was Sandra bound, according to Herman, just hours after finding her. He then says that Herman answers that question, that she was bound by her arms and not by her wrists. How that can be read into Herman's words from the interview is entirely beyond me. Herman states 8 times that the bindings were applied to Sandra's hands, 8 separate times, and he never says her arms are tied. Yet we have this extraordinary claim from Bob. I honestly don't know what to make of it. It's such a blatant lie. It isn't even a twisting of the words. It's claiming that words were spoken that weren't, and claiming that other words weren't spoken as much as they actually were. I've seen some remarkable things over the years, but I've never seen someone try to play out such an incredible lie to a large group of people and genuinely hope that it's going to be believed, especially when everyone he is speaking to has the information available to them that shows that it is a lie. I just wanted to make a few more quick points about Herman's reflection on that evening and highlight aspects that once again and very conveniently were not raised by Bob. Now, Herman recounts how he cuts off Sandra's bindings and leaves the pieces on the floor in the master bathroom closet. And Deputy Garcia asks Herman to confirm this. He asks him to confirm exactly where the pieces of the bindings were left. And Herman confirms that after he cut them off, he left them there on the floor of the closet. And why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant for 2 reasons. 1, the cut bindings weren't found in the closet, as most of you would know. They were found in the master bathroom. And secondly, that Herman cut the hand bindings off himself. His wife Maria only began assisting with the bindings around Sandra's ankles. Now, if you need any convincing of that, I strongly suggest that you read the transcripts from Maria's interview with Deputy Garcia, specifically the sections relating to her involvement in the removal of Sandra's hand bindings. As we've spoken about in an earlier episode, Maria states that she never observed any hand bindings, as when she observed Sandra, she only had the feet bindings on. before we return to the crime scene report, here at our 10th episode, I wanted to highlight how far we've come. From episode 1, which was really the culmination of a lot of effort of a few of us to set the record straight, to where we are today, with our audience and listeners to each episode expanding each day, and our Facebook group growing and engaging in some incredibly productive discussions that have resulted in the identification of some important pieces of evidence that was only possible through our group's efforts. It's worth highlighting at this stage of our progression of the development of our podcast and our Truth is Justice project that our group is comprised of a range of people. There are those that fully believe the right person has been convicted, and then there are those that are seeking more information to make an informed decision on the case. The important part is that people who are engaging in discussions on our Facebook page and via direct communication with the group of us that are running this project are genuinely interested in finding out more information about the case. And many of our listeners are not committed one way or another, but they do have an open mind, an independent mind, a mind that's willing to listen to the actual information and decide for themselves whether what they are hearing is the truth or not. And in that context, we're not talking about questions of interpretation. We're talking about whether a particular point or interpretation of evidence is valid or not. Whether that point is legitimate, represented by the evidence, and something that most reasonable people would agree with. If it isn't, then we raise it and we address it, for the benefit of the victim of this crime, Jim. So, if, as a listener, you are told that Sandra Melgar has perfectly manicured nails, yes, perfectly manicured nails, we show you the pictures of Sandra's nails and you can decide for yourself whether her nails are actually perfectly manicured or not. If you are told that a 32-inch TV has been stolen from the master bedroom, we show you evidence of a 32-inch TV that is photographed in the office at the time of the murder, and which is the TV that the family went to significant lengths to obtain the receipt of months after the murder, despite the shop being 5 hours away from the family home. If you were told that the back door shows signs internally of a screwdriver or crowbar or some other device designed to compromise the security of the door, we show you the outside photos of the door that show no damage. If you are told that the burglary resulted in the theft of a white Xbox, we show you the photographs of the location where the white Xbox was supposedly kept, and highlight how irrational it is to believe that the Xbox was even visible to the intruder. If you are told that the intruders fled the scene in a panic after unexpectedly murdering Jim, then we show the evidence that not only did they leave through an avenue that created noise and illuminated the area, but they were considerate enough to close the door between the garage and laundry behind them, a door that wasn't lockable, a door that, if it was open, may have allowed the suggested free-roaming dogs to escape out into the street. If you were told that Deputy Garcia injected the word hands into his interview with Herman, we highlight for you how Herman used the Spanish word for hands 5 times before the word hands was even raised by Deputy Garcia. If you're told that the southeast corner bedroom, the bedroom formerly occupied by Liz, was ransacked and searched through by burglars, we'll show you how only a handful of drawers were opened and the contents were undisturbed. If you were told that a poster was torn off the wall and jewellery thrown across the floor, we show you a poster that's simply lost its adhesion and 2 items that have fallen on the floor next to the jewellery box and were probably forgotten about. And we can go on and on with our examples. But you see, we tell you things, not always the comfortable things, not always the things you might want to hear depending on your views with respect to the case, but we tell the truth, the facts, an absolute and accurate reflection of the evidence. And why? Why do we do that? Because, and this is very important, we have no vested interest in this case being established as a wrongful conviction case. We have no reputation to uphold in this field. We do not rely on an income based solely on our ability to present to an audience a wrongful conviction case for them to study. No. We give you the facts as they are, and we allow you to decide for yourself. Put simply, we are here to ensure that the correct facts are distributed, that the correct material is dispersed in a way that allows people to form their own opinions on the case, not the opinions communicated by people with a definite agenda. If you review the facts as we present them, and you're comfortable with your views on the case, whatever those views are, then we have achieved our purpose. We have ensured that an unbiased and objective perspective on the case has been communicated and distributed amongst people who, without our project, without Truth is Justice, would not have had access to the information that they do. So for those people that have listened to our episodes and began to question the information they are being provided with by Bob's show, we are thankful that our work has been able to achieve so much. That is what we do here at Truth is Justice. We are the group dedicated to the process of setting the record straight. Now, back to the week-by-week analysis. And Bob begins episode 7 with the comment that either multiple offenders entered the house on the night of Jim's murder to burglarise it, or Sandra staged it to look like they did. And Bob asks his audience to consider for a moment if this was a home invasion / burglary, and asks his audience to consider what the scene is telling us so far. And Bob notes that he believes that the point of entry is through the backyard. And the basis for that opinion? That someone attempted to force the back door open. But what do we actually see? On the photographs of the outside of the door, we see nothing. No marks, no scratches, no damage to the door that would indicate in any way that someone was trying to force that door open. And Bob does note that the back door being dead-bolted shut is, in his words, puzzling. Puzzling. Rather than simply representing a back door that has been dead-bolted shut, Bob presents a couple of different theories. And remember that we've heard previously how Jim was security conscious and would always ensure that the doors and windows were locked and secured. Yet, that isn't one of the theories offered up or considered by Bob. The first theory offered up is that the intruders were already in the house before Jim approached the door. Because Bob claims that we don't know for certain whether the door was locked. And what evidence do we have for that assertion? Once again, all we have is Sandra's own testimony. Sandra's own statements that she didn't know whether the back door was locked, and her claims that Jim approached the back door because the dogs were barking. And let's think about that for a second, because Bob goes on to suggest that the intruders were already, in this scenario, likely at the front of the house in either the guest bedroom or southeast corner bedroom by the time that Jim approached the back door. Firstly, if the intruders were already inside the house and in the southeast corner bedroom, why would the dogs be still barking at the back door? Either they would have followed the supposed intruders into the front of the house, and remember, we've heard how the dogs could escape that area in which they were kept, or they probably would have run towards Jim and Sandra. The second theory is that when Jim approaches the back door, he is rushed by the supposed intruders. So we can think a bit more about that. The intruders, who we've been told by Bob likely picked the Melgar house due to the relative privacy and isolated nature of the Melgar's backyard, accessible through the side gate, that they would have then waited at the back door with barking dogs and nearby neighbouring homes for either Jim or Sandra to approach the back door to let the dogs in. That seems highly inconsistent to me. And just one brief side point. And this photo is on our website, but we'll add it to the podcast episode 10 page for easy reference. Now take note of the neighbour's home to the left of the Melgar's home. The left is where the gate was leading to the back of the Melgar's home. The neighbour has a number of large windows that any potential intruder would have passed directly by to access the gate. Now how's that relevant? Well, it demonstrates that the surrounds of this area were highly visible. It was not overly private with large walled front gardens or even walled side fences. They are visually very open homes. Both sides of the home have clear views to the large windows of neighbouring homes. The most private area of the front of the home appears to be the area in and around the front door. And that's relevant when we think about the route the supposed intruders took to leave the house. And Bob continues on with a description of how the intruder theory would have played out with 3 or 4 intruders possibly being present. Now what's interesting here is aspects of the description which are entirely contradictory to other parts of the evidence. For example, Bob highlights how an intruder may have been in the southeast corner bedroom looking for small items to steal and then left that room when things went wrong. Bob's reason being that items like computers and other electronics were left in that office, and it appears that they didn't even enter there. So how is this inconsistent? Well, the intruder that was apparently present in the southeast corner bedroom supposedly stole an Xbox, which could be reasonably described as hidden under the furthest corner of the bed, and would have taken someone getting down on their hands and knees to find it. Whilst leaving a laptop and charger in clear sight that they would have passed by in this hunt for the Xbox. Now, it's worth noting also that the laptop appears entirely undisturbed, so it isn't like they assessed the value of it or checked the brand and then decided to keep searching. They seemingly didn't even touch it. The second big problem with the theory proposed by Bob is the method of exit of the house. And Bob suggests that something happened, likely Jim's murder, that scared the intruders into fleeing the home. But let's think through that. They make the decision to flee the home, yet they choose possibly the most visible location to neighbours and to the whole street of the whole property, the garage door. And we have a combination of the noise of the door opening, the lights from inside the garage, the motion-activated light, the obstacles throughout the garage, and with those obstacles I mean both sides. Now, Bob often states that it was likely that the wrong door was raised by the intruders, that they perhaps simply hit the wrong button. Now, this was just an average size garage, so the space available on either side of the car, if that was the intended exit point, was very limited, and you can see for yourself on the photos. Now, that's fine if we're talking individuals not carrying anything and not in a rush, but Bob suggests that they're carrying a lot of stuff. A 32-inch television, at least one other knife, 3 very heavy and large power tools, a guitar, an Xbox, a DVD player, and you get the point. All of that was, according to Bob, manoeuvred out of the Melgar's cluttered garage without disturbing 2 bags of leaves and being considerate enough to close the door behind them between the garage and the laundry. And all of that apparently whilst in a panic. Now, I've often wondered, as many of you have, why the intruders wouldn't simply leave via the front door. Now, they obviously no longer need to worry about the residents of the home, Jim and Sandra. Their priority would be to leave as quietly as possible without attracting any attention. Now, the front door, as I highlighted earlier, is the best place across the front of the home for that. The argument's been offered that they were somehow stacking items in the garage to load into a car. It would have been just as easy and offered far more protection for any intruders to stack items near the front door and leave that way. In many ways, I believe that is where we get evidence that this supposed investigation of the case by Bob is somewhat narrowly focused on Sandra's acquittal. So rather than considering all the elements that represent a problem to a given theory, for example the multiple intruders leaving in a panicked state, only the parts of the evidence that support it are considered. And those parts are usually vague, unsubstantiated, and in many cases misleading. And continuing on now with the crime scene room by room analysis, and Bob moves on to the master bathroom, which is where we'll go next. One of the first things you'll notice about the report is the description of the knife. The 6-inch Calphalon chef's knife. You recall on one of our early episodes how Bob appeared to mock Ms. Barnett's description of the knife blade as being 6 inches in length. And here we receive confirmation that the blade was indeed 6 inches, and there's not an apology or note made that Ms. Barnett was indeed correct. Absolutely nothing. It simply passes right by without acknowledgement. The damage in trying to diminish Ms. Barnett's knowledge of this specific element of the case was achieved, and all through a false and baseless claim that it turns out was entirely incorrect. And the other thing you'll notice about the knife description is Mr. Carpenter's description of the knife as being the same style as the knife in the kitchen. And Bob here goes on the attack against Mr. Carpenter in this respect. He recognises that there was indeed another Calphalon knife in the kitchen, but highlighting the different types of knives, one being a chef's knife and the other a Santoku knife. Now, I don't actually think this was a huge point, well, not big enough to dwell on anyway, but Mr. Carpenter may well have been using the word style to refer to the brand, or the make of the knife, not necessarily the exact type of knife. But either way, Mr. Carpenter himself took photos of the 2 knives, so I don't see any issue with him trying to deceive in any way. And finishing up with the knife, if you're not familiar with the 2 types of knives, a chef's knife and a Santoku knife, go online and do a quick search of the Calphalon chef's knife and a Calphalon Santoku knife. You may notice, like I did, the similarity in the appearance of the knives. And they're clearly not the same, I'm not saying that, but for most people, myself included, they are similar enough. It isn't like we're comparing a toaster and a frying pan, for example. Now, it was an opportunity, though, for Bob to draw attention to something else about Mr Carpenter's report that Bob feels is in some way failing, and then to further add to the negative image of Mr Carpenter that Bob shares with his audience. Bob then draws attention to the presence of the knife and the blouse and the towels in the jacuzzi. And Bob suggests that an easier possibility, if Sandra murdered Jim, would have been for her to, as Bob puts it, wash and disinfect the knife and put it away, and wash and put away the blouse and the towels and simply hide them amongst all the other clothes and items in the closet in the hope that they would be missed. Now, I think most people would be aware that cleaning an item of blood being visible to the eye is one thing, but cleaning an item of blood which is able to be observed forensically is entirely another. And my view is that if the knife was cleaned and put away, it would leave the very real possibility open that police would search for the murder weapon, and perhaps a spot they would start is the knives in the kitchen. And a few simple tests later, and the presence of traces of blood on the knife may be confirmed. And that creates a situation that's very hard to explain, especially if you're insisting that an intruder broke into the house and used the knife to murder Jim. That intruder wouldn't then go and clean and put away the knife. Now, does that take a criminally sophisticated mind to think through that process? No, not at all. Just the ability to recognise that trying to hide those items would potentially create a more unknown and difficult situation. Or perhaps it's possible that it was even just not thought about much at all. The items were simply thrown in the jacuzzi and that was that. No criminal sophistication, just a traumatic night and a decision made for some reason that only the murderer actually knows. Bob continues on with the report and makes note of the pillow sham not being positioned under the chair, but rather bunched up beside the chair. I think it's worth noting here that this is another example of the assumption being made that the scene was exactly as it was in the seconds after Sandra's discovery. Remember, we heard how when Herman cut Sandra's hand bindings, he left the pieces on the floor in the closet. Well, the pieces are not on the floor in the closet, they're on the floor in the bathroom. So, were they moved, or was it simply a case of Herman not remembering correctly? You also recall how Maria helped Sandra and sat her down in the chair. Now that would involve potentially moving the chair to a position where Sandra could conveniently and easily sit down on it. So the fact that the pillow sham is no longer under the legs of the chair is almost largely irrelevant in my opinion, because we simply don't know how it was positioned when it was first removed from under the door. Now the pillow shams themselves are an interesting element, and we'll come back to them in the coming weeks, but an interesting point that was not raised here by Bob is that the pillow sham that was found closest to the closet door has a tear in it. And importantly, out of the 3 of them located in the master bedroom, the 3 of the pillow shams, it's the only one which has that tear. So when demonstrations were performed by investigators that evening on possible methods of how to wedge the chair under the door, the tear in the pillow sham matched up perfectly with the side of the door in such a way that would cause the tear to appear. And Bob then moves on to the master bathroom closet, but for this week, we'll leave it there for now, and we'll pick up the report at the master bathroom closet next week. Thank you very much again for listening, and we look forward to you joining us next week as we continue to set the record straight.